Hi everyone, this is the PowerPoint talk that you all will be missing because you can't attend the live class on Thursday for the three-part series on transgender youth and families. So for the month of August, we've watched 3 different films. Just Charlie on August the 7th, Transforming Gender documentary on August the 14th, and 2 TED Talks on August the 21st. So I wanted to just take a moment and say that I was so impressed with the feedback that I got from you all after watching the film and the documentary, that when I went to synthesize all of this education and information, I decided that I would just use quotes from people's feedback to kind of illustrate what it is that we've learned in this course. So I think that it was pretty clear that we have contextualized the concept of pronouns. I know this is often a concept that is difficult for people to fully understand, but I felt that after watching the movie Just Charlie, a number of people really seemed to grasp why this is so important for trans youth. So one person said, pronouns are a way we can affirm someone's identity. Charlie's mother and sister demonstrated respect for Charlie's identity and demanded respect from others as well. And it was really poignant to watch these characters use the proper pronouns when they addressed Charlie and when they talked about Charlie with other people. We learned about the fact that families go through a process. They all go through a process of transition. One person wrote that parents, family, friends of trans youth can play a vital role by accepting, affirming, and loving that child, thereby making a great, healthy difference in that child's life, a child's world. Another person said, I felt incredibly proud of Charlie's mother. Throughout the entire movie, she seemed to support Charlie from the beginning and was willing to risk her own relationship for her child. She stayed strong when her mother sent a letter saying she did not want to see the family again, and she even kicked her own husband out of the house when it was clear that he was unable to support Charlie. And I just want to pause and say that, sadly, in many cases, families like Charlie's, it's not the parent that gets kicked out of the house, it's the child. And that's why a lot of these kids end up in our foster care system. The person went on to say, as a social worker in child welfare, I've heard too many stories of parents unwilling to leave partners or family members to protect their children. It was refreshing to see a portrayal of a parent unwavering in her support of her child, regardless the cost. I think we learned about how this rich content can influence our social work practice. As a social worker, I found myself evaluating all of the characters' responses and approaches to the situation and thinking of ways we could offer assistance. I really appreciated how the film didn't shy away from the struggles each family member had and their different ways of dealing and healing. It was a great way to get us thinking without feeling political or social pressure. Another person said, as a culture, we don't acknowledge gender fluidity. When we center gender as a demographic on our forms and identity and identification, I understand it is difficult to remove these indicators. For example, gender questions are all over foster care paperwork, even though Turning Points for Children, PHMC, and DHS claim to be affirming and inclusive. Everything is either male or female. Some of that may be based on ignorance or an unwillingness to take the time necessary to change paperwork. Getting rid of these indicators on forms and IDs would help people in these groups be seen and would help us as a culture realize that the construct of gender doesn't mean as much as we think it does. I love this. I feel like this person could get an A+ from me. That is exactly correct. And I'm so glad that this was so well communicated through the documentary that we watched on transforming gender. We learned about discrimination. A person, one of the people in the class said, the discriminatory presumption that trans equals deceit or secret plays a huge part when it comes to discrimination for employment, housing, education, etc. We also learned that trans folks who look trans encounter more discrimination and violence. Passing in this context means that they can quickly identify the person as male or female. Another person said, I did not realize the level of discrimination faced by trans people. Forcing so many into unsafe work or lifestyles because they are not always able to support themselves through stable employment. And that is a really important point. It is like it's a very cyclical process. Because there is so much harsh discrimination, because it is so difficult for trans and non-binary people to move throughout their world, many are relegated and pushed into the margins, into unsafe situations and into illegal ways of making an income. Another person wrote, I think removing gender markers makes the environment safer for gender and non-conforming trans people because your gender has no bearing on whether or not you can drive, ride a train, etc. And it's typically used to discriminate against people anyway. We learned that family support is critically important to trans youth, right? This person pointed out that in the documentary, the psychologist said that supportive families cuts the risk of suicide for trans youth by 93%. That is an outstanding number, which is why it's so important that we as professionals find ways to support families and foster families, be affirming of trans children. I learned that even from the age of 2, an individual can question and assess their own identity and gender. And I just want to take a minute and pause here to remember this child's story. So this little girl knew exactly who she was at the age of 2, and her family supported her, and she was able to make a seamless transition. But it wasn't until, I guess, puberty, is my understanding of the documentary, that she really began to experience extreme forms of discrimination in the school setting. So severe that she had to kind of retreat who she was and become more gender neutral. And I can't help but wonder and worry, what is the psychological side effect of this on this child? How is she growing up to understand herself and the world around her, which has shown to be so incredibly unsafe? This story makes me extremely sad, and thank God, that she has a supportive family, because she had no supportive family and she was trying to go to school in such a hostile environment. One wonders what would happen to this kid. We learned about compassion. I saw compassion in so many of the comments that you all shared with me, and it was really moving to me. It was very powerful. So one person wrote, be careful and considerate about the questions you ask. A transgendered person's identity does not depend on what things they have or haven't done to transition. I learned that there is a whole continuum which shouldn't be limited to only male or female. And that is precisely the point, that if we could just relax some of these very rigid binary perceptions of the world around us. If we could just let children and teenagers and people just be who they are without needing to police their gender expression or their gender identity, it would be a much safer and peaceful place for all of us. So in addition to what you all have said that you've learned, I want to back that up with some statistics, just a couple of important statistics to kind of drive home the point. So 80%, and all of these statistics are found in the supplemental reading that I gave you all. 84% of transgendered youth do not feel safe in the classroom. 84%, that's a staggering number. Over half of young trans people can never use the restroom at their school that aligns with their gender. Transgendered youth have more than 3.6 times the rate of suicide ideation, and only 4% of transgender youth say they are out about their gender identity to their religious community. 30% of transgender employees report having been fired or discriminated against in the work environment because of their gender identity or expression. The unemployment rate among transgender people is 3 times higher than that of the general population. 48% of transgender people say that none of their identity or records reflect the correct name and their gender. So just think about that impact, right? How difficult it would be to get a job if your identification did not match your gender expression or your gender. You're set up to kind of fail right from the get-go. Nearly 1 in 3 transgender people report living in poverty. So it's no wonder that poverty rates among transgender people is so high. 22 to 38% of transgender people have been harassed by the police, with upwards of 15% experiencing physical abuse and 7% being sexually assaulted by law enforcement. This statistic gets me every time. 50% of transgender people have experienced sexual violence. 50%. That's staggering. And then 41% of Black transgender people report experiencing homelessness at some point in their lives, more than 5 times the rate of our general U.S. population. So these statistics are staggering. They illustrate quite clearly that there is an enormous amount of discrimination that exists against transgender and non-binary folks in our country. As social workers, we are called to not only do good social work practice, but to be socially engaged. And so I just think it's important to remember the people that you met in these films and documentaries and these TED Talks when you think about, when you find yourself working with a transgender youth or family. So I want to end with this because I think it's really important. Despite all the barriers that trans people face on a daily basis, we have incredible examples of leaders in the trans community and cultural icons. It is incredible and bizarre to consider the kind of discrimination experienced by trans folks, and in particular when you consider the political climate that we're living in and the kind of policies that have been put forth by this administration, specifically targeting trans folks. And yet there are still people who rise up out of that and are incredibly successful. We may know people in our work environment who are incredibly successful, who are living well-adjusted, healthy, happy, fully actualized lives. But anyway, these are just some examples of folks. So the first person here is Mr. Ford has spent 10 years as a producer at PBS. He made Academy history when he was nominated in 2018 as the first openly trans director to be nominated for an Oscar. Kyle is the first openly transgender NCAA Division I player. And then Jeanette, you all may know her. She is a really renowned producer, writer, transgender activist. She's produced and written a really wonderful FX series called Pose. Some of you may be aware of it. If you haven't, check it out. It's wonderful. But anyway, she's fantastic. She spent 5 years, and I didn't know this until I looked her up, as an editor at People magazine. Other examples, Laverne Cox is a producer. She's best known for her role as a transgender character in Netflix Orange is the New Black. Ivan is a transgender stand-up comedian and actor who's best known for his role in the Amazon TV series Transparent. It's also a great show if you're interested in kind of expanding your TV watching. Both of them are actually really good, both Orange is the New Black and Transparent. These are people you should know. Rachel Levine is an American pediatrician. She currently serves as the Secretary of Health for the state of Pennsylvania. She is on the news every week reporting out about the pandemic. She's been the subject of some pretty horrific harassment as an openly trans woman because of the pandemic, because she's really taken center stage. But she's a phenomenal leader and accomplished woman. Amanda is the highest ranked openly trans appointee in American history. She's served as the Department Secretary of Defense since 2015. And then you should know this person. Cecilia is the first openly trans woman to be the executive director of the Mayor's Liaison Office of LGBTQ Affairs for the city of Philadelphia. There are many, many examples of well-accomplished, important trans people, both historically and today. These are just some that I pulled out. There's plenty of good examples. So now that you know, ask yourself, how will you protect transgender and gender non-conforming kids, right? What are things that you can do to help these young people be safe in our child welfare system? Certainly what you've learned from this 3-part series on the experiences of trans youth and transgender people in our country, being able to help a foster family or a birth family understand what it means to be trans, and why it is so important that young people be supported through this process. Now that you know, how will you support parents of transgender and gender non-conforming kids? Recognizing that families go through a process, and that process is extremely important. I think all too often in the child welfare system, we have taken a posture of, if a parent or a kinship family member cannot support a trans or LGBTQ youth, they're not worth our time and investment, and kids get yanked away from family. That is so destructive. It's really important that we put resources and energy into supporting these families, because as you have learned, families play a critically important role in the well-being of transgendered youth. And so the last thing I want to end with is Turning Points for Children has asked all of us to use our pronouns in our signature with our email. If you have not done this, I encourage all of you to do it today. Using proper pronouns in your signature is not really about you. It's actually about you sending a message out to a trans youth that might be wanting to get in touch with you, or a colleague that you work with, or a parent who may be struggling or needing support as their child goes through a transition. Pronouns, acknowledging one's pronouns and sharing them is creating a safe place. It's signaling to trans folks in our community that you get it and that you are an ally. So I really encourage you all to do that today if you haven't already. Thank you so much for your time. I've loved doing this with all of you. I will be creating a questionnaire probably when I get back from my vacation, which is not in October, but actually in September. I got my dates wrong. I'm living in the month of September already. Anyway, so please look for that. Thank you again so much for your time, and reach out to me if you have any questions.